Okay, now we're to our third, last but not least, holiday recipe. And this is everyone's favorite eggnog. And we're gonna make it old school with actual eggs. And I know that this is a little controversial today because of salmonella. So if you are a little squeamish, you can use egg beaters, which are homogenized and they're not gonna have salmonella. You can also, if you go online, it will give you instructions on basically raising the temperature of the egg to the point where salmonella is killed, but not so much that it actually cooks the interior of the egg so that the yolk cooks. And so you can go ahead and do it that way. The traditional way of this being served, it has enough alcohol in it that it probably would kill off the salmonella, but I'm not a doctor and I'm not promising you that. Okay, so this is actually the only sort of tricky part. There are parts of this recipe that are work, but this is the tricky part, because what you need to do is very carefully separate out the yolks and keep them separate, because any little bit of egg yolk in the whites and you're not going to be able to go ahead and get them whipped up. A half a cup of sugar, and we're going to mix that in with the egg yolks. And so you're going to make this nice and creamy, sort of a lemon yellow is what you're looking for. Dissolving that sugar in the fat. That is looking pretty good. Okay, that's a nice lemony yellow. Now, it would have been a big mistake for me to go ahead and use that whisk for the next step, because that has got the contamination on it. It's a very old kind of a beverage, mixing egg for the frothiness and some sort of beverage. Very often this was called a flip. You would flip it back and forth between two glasses to make it creamy. In this case, the eggnog is an American tradition. Actually, you can only really buy it this time of year. But if you go to the store and you try to buy commercial alcoholic eggnog, there is only one brand, which is Old Pennsylvania Dutch brand. And so a strong connection to the Pennsylvania Dutch tradition, like we have up here in the valley. And actually, this is the eggnog recipe from the Comer family that I drank many years before I ever got involved with work at the furnace, because again, it is part of their family tradition from this area. The eggnog that we know today is actually, one of the people that made it famous was a Afro-American restaurateur and bartender named Cato Alexander. He was born a slave, we believe down in the South because of his culinary influences. Went ahead and started working in restaurants, began to be a good cook and a good bartender, and began to realize that the rich white clientele liked his spicy food, his gumbo and fried chicken and curried oysters, and they liked the strong, rich, sweet drinks that he was making. And so his Carolina milk punch, which is basically milk punch made with bourbon, and eggnog became quite famous. And so Cato, once he amassed a little bit of money, opened a roadhouse on Manhattan Island where he would go ahead and feed and serve drinks to the rich clientele. And it became quite famous. It was about a half-an-hour race from the tip of Manhattan, so the rich young swells would get in their buggy carts and race out to Cato's to drink and eat and then race back. Unfortunately, being an Afro-American and being a businessman, he attracted also some of the wrong kind of attention, and he was the target of a couple of racial attacks. He once famously had his restaurant broken into, and he and his pregnant wife were beaten. And it's possible that that occurred because he also was quite famous for being generous in lending money and extending credit to his clientele. And if you can imagine the relations and political situation at that time in the mid-1800s in New York, it may have been very hard for him to enforce payment. That time he was beaten up, it could have been something as simple as saying, "Gentlemen, it would be lovely if you would pay your tab." Because how would a black man talk with him that way? And so he lost a lot of money from not getting his debts repaid, had to close Cato's, eventually opened a small restaurant down in Broadway, but it only lasted about a year. And unfortunately, he died destitute at the age of 77, having been one of the most famous restaurateurs in New York at that time. It was famously said, if you had not been to Cato's, you had not lived. And so again, eggnog, in some ways, is a little bit of story about, again, that Afro-American part of our history, which sometimes we forget. We're going to go ahead and put some in a punch bowl, and we're going to dress the table with our fruit cake and our root beer and the cookies that were made earlier and our eggnog, and get ready for everybody to show up for Belschnickel.